Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Our focus today is on the Iraqi parliamentary election. The title of this webinar is Unpacking Iraq's Parliamentary Elections, Significance, Outcomes, and Implications. We have a great audience from at least 3 time zones, so good day to all of you and a warm welcome, and a special, of course, thank you to our speakers today, whom I will introduce in a couple of minutes after my introductory remarks. As we all know, the parliamentary elections in Iraq, actually the 5th such vote since the US-led invasion in the country in 2003, took place quite peacefully, if I might say, and as scheduled on Sunday, October 10th. The elections essentially determined the membership of the 329 seats in the Council of Representatives in Iraq, including a surprising record of 97 female lawmakers who will then participate collectively in electing the president and the prime minister of Iraq. Of course, the complexity of the Iraqi political system, which is defined primarily along sectarian and ethnic lines, coupled with the popular protests in recent years, 2019, in particular, calling for the removal of the entire political class, clearly rendered this election particularly critical to Iraq's volatile domestic affairs and the legitimacy and conduct of its government. To that end, Arab Center Washington, D.C. has convened this panel of very distinguished Iraq experts to discuss the significance of these elections and the implications of the outcomes. Speakers will also address the multiple players and candidates in these elections, the turnout and results, especially following calls for boycott from prominent Iraqi leaders, the fairness and credibility of the process and the representative nature of the system, the electoral system, the internal and external reactions, if you will, to this poll. They will also consider the ramifications of the turnout and outcomes for Iraq, for the region, and beyond in terms of international powers or countries involved in the region, and what these outcomes herald for the much needed reforms and democratic governance sought by the people of Iraq. Each speaker, ladies and gentlemen, this morning will speak for about 12 minutes to be followed by a Q&A session with the participation of the audience. Please enter your brief questions by clicking the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom page. Identify your name and affiliation, and specify the panelists to whom you would like to address your questions, and I will be more than delighted to read your questions to our speakers. Alternatively, you may email your questions if you do not have that Zoom button at the bottom of your page. Our email is at events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org. Let me now go ahead and introduce our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking this morning. First is Zeidon Alkinani, who's a political researcher and an analyst specializing in Iraq and the Middle East. He's a doctoral candidate and teaching assistant in politics and international relations, University of Aberdeen, and non-resident research fellow in foreign policy at the IRAM Center for Iranian Studies in Ankara, Turkey. He will be starting essentially with giving us an overview of the election results and attempt to deal with some of the other issues that I've raised in my introductory remarks. After Zeidon, Nussaibah Younis, a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, will speak, and she will talk about the significance of the elections for Iraq and for the regions and the implications, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, particularly for democratization and governance reforms. Following that would be Abbas Kadhim, well known to you. He has spoken at Arab Center before. Abbas is resident senior fellow and director, the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C., and a quite frequent commentator on Iraqi affairs and U.S. Iraqi relations. And he will be, again, talking about significance of elections and their outcomes, and particularly with reference to the prospects for change and implications for U.S. policy and U.S.-Iraq bilateral relations. Finally, Maria Fantappie will conclude with her remarks about regional influence in the elections and impact on the region, particularly the relationship with Iran, and maybe with some reference to some other topics she's researched, like the Kurdish participation and the Kurdish issue. Maria is Special Advisor for Middle East and North Africa region at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. And I hope you will have a stimulating program for you today, explaining or putting in context the elections in Iraq that we witnessed this past Sunday. Zeidon, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalil, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Arab Center in DC for the invitation. Unlike many other analyses on the outcomes of the elections, the voter turnout, and the possible coalition formations, which of course is still very interesting due to the expected, of course, Sadrist victory and the Taqaddum victory from Halbusi's side, and the unexpected drastic defeat of the pro-Iran Al-Fatah coalition. From my side, I'll be discussing more how the various forces from the October protest movement, as we call it Tishreen, engages with the early elections through the boycott element. And since the elections, as we mentioned, is a result to the Tishreen uprising itself. The Tishreen protests, which began in October 2019, initially called and focused on an end to corruption, an end to the ethnic sectarian quota-based distribution of power, which is known as the Muhassasa al-Ta'ifiyya, and against the limitations of freedom of speech by impunity, and a drastic constitutional reform, which is probably one of the major challenges faced by the protest movement when they are questioned about it. In short, the protesters wanted an overhaul of the current system and not a reform of the same political system and political parties. So, meaning Tishreen presented the post-2003 Iraq's most significant rebellion against the political system, and it was also the loudest rejection against Iranian role or intervention in the country since 2003. And that is very important considering Iran's major support to Baghdad's government or the political system and class in Iraq. And as a result, Iraq, of course, witnessed drastic developments such as new governmental formations, rising presence of militias, and an emerging US-Iran dispute, and the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which alarmed the region and not just Iraq, and the continuous assassinations of activists and protesters. So the early elections is just one single angle of an overarching list of events that has been happening due to Tishreen. And of course, before I dig deeper into what the early elections mean for Tishreen, we must briefly mention some of the most outcomes, the most successful outcomes possibly from the protest movement. And to start with, I would say the governmental compensations, which in return are considered as achievements by Tishreen uprising's continuous resilience in pressuring the government for change. And of course, while some are considered as symbolic achievements, others were more strategic. The first symbolic achievement was arguably the announced resignation of Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi late November 2019, just weeks following the outbreak of the Tishreen protests. And it was this resignation that motivated or led to the formation of a new government under the current leadership of Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi in May 2020. Now, despite being formed by the same agreements of the same political class and muhassasa system, it reflected the people's ability to push for change. And for those reasons, Prime Minister Kadhimi's government was, of course, rejected by most Tishreen forces because they made it very clear that their focus is on the political system and the class and not just Abdel Mahdi as a figure or his cabinet in particular. However, one thing that the Tishreen protest movement would credit Prime Minister Kadhimi is that his government did offer early elections, which took place on October 10th. And to add to that, Tishreen's pressure led to the government to present a minor electoral reform, which is considered to be the most strategic achievement by Tishreen. The electoral reform, which led to the breaking down of 18 electoral districts into 83. It's seen as an attempt to diversify the districts, and that way voters will have a more open representation and the ability to vote directly for independent candidates rather than wasting their votes on powerful coalitions they didn't vote for from the first place, which we witnessed every 4 years. Now, how do Tishreen various forces engage with the early elections? And now, how we aim to utilize this rebellious Tishreen moment to achieve those objectives is where we witness the implications of the differences within the protest movement. And the main divisions on the political participation were as to either boycott the elections and refuse the political system's attempt to re-legitimize itself through early elections and continue to act as an only electoral democracy, or there was to participate and form political parties that would represent or that would elect themselves in the early elections and to represent and arguably defend the demands of the Iraqi protesters and the Iraqi people. Now, of course, the boycott camp expectedly questioned the purpose of participating in elections in a system where they're not even able to criticize the government or even criticize political parties and militias without being subject to violence and having to live with living standards of rising unemployment and poor public services, reasons or indicators that pushed Tishreen to happen from the first place. And it makes us question that is an efficient and established democracy. Should it end at elections? It shouldn't end at elections, or else it will only be an electoral democracy, as we mentioned. And of course, many people would disagree with that point and argue that Iraq is a young democracy and that today's Iraq, from a democratic perspective, and particularly when it comes to the limited freedom of speech, is still better than pre-2003 Iraq. But then it makes us question that, is Iraq under Saddam Hussein the benchmark we are comparing with? Is it efficient or applicable to compare an almost 2 decades old democracy with a terrible dictatorship? And then another indicator for the boycott camp was the low chances of winning. And the indicators, as per the observers and protesters within Tishreen and beyond, pushed or justified the boycott as a reason for them not believing that they won't gain a good or an efficient amount of seats in parliament. And this assumption also considers their lack of interest groups, funding, media support, and regional support, unlike the other traditional political parties. However, this argument could be easily countered by the minor victory in votes by the Imtidad movement, which also emerges out of Tishreen, which I'll briefly mention about soon. And then you have the main goal to overhaul the political system, the main radicalized aim and objective of the protest, of the young protest movement. And they use that as a justification when they look at that participating in the early elections is, as we mentioned, a legitimization of the same political class, meaning it will not guarantee, if not at all, an overhaul of the political system that would create an interim or a new interim government consisted of technocratic candidates with no association or influence from the traditional political parties, and particularly the ones with influence or intimidation from the political parties with armed wings. And this mainly leads to the fact that any elections with the same political class and the same agreements, such as the Muhassasa, will eventually form a government that will seem to be very similar to the previous governments. And of course, an end to the Muhassasa is at the core of Tishreen's aims and objectives, whether it's Iraq's Tishreen or the Lebanese protest movement Tishreen. Therefore, participating in these elections under the same Muhassasa is seen, as we mentioned, a re-legitimization of the system. The boycott camp, however, is also challenged by questions on the lack of a clear roadmap to alternative actions. However, that criticism very recently was responded by the establishment of a political opposition that took place on August 10th by Al-Bayt al-Watani, the National House, and that is a political party that emerged also out of Tishreen. Al-Bayt al-Watani's move was seen as a new challenge faced by the political system, because in post-2003 Iraq, political opposition was mainly seen on the ground through either protesting and social activism, and briefly through parliament with very fragile attempts to achieve an effective number of seats in parliament, or nor the ability to gain ministerial positions without the overshadowing influence of the traditional political parties. And this newly established political opposition project presents a more established and politicized social entity that aims to hold the government accountable as an active civil society. And then on the other hand, you have the participation camp, anti-boycott camp, which takes us back to the Imtidad movement, which gained a good amount of seats for a new emerging political party out of Tishreen that unilaterally participated in these elections. And it was very clear in their early stages about the importance of participating in the elections and ensuring an honest representation of the people and the protesters. And they believe that change requires patience and time, and it can only happen from within the system. Of course, with great consideration of the costly sacrifices and attempts to change it through disobedient and peaceful rebellion. But many would consider Tishreen's, when we look at these two clashing opinions or approaches towards the early elections between the pro-participation and the pro-boycott camps, many would consider these diverse approaches as an alarming indicator of fragmentation. But that also could lead to a very simplistic judgment, because it is very natural for a nationwide upheaval to carry with it so many clashing and different ideologies. It is just as long as the fundamental demand or demands are met on common grounds, and in the case of Tishreen's fundamental values, as we mentioned, it's the end of an end to the Muhassasa system, an end to militia violence, and an evident political and economic reform that would reflect upon Iraq's public services such as electricity, healthcare, education. And it's very important to note that Tishreen is not a single entity, and it will never be, for us to expect it to be centralized in one direction. It's a wave of new political and social attitudes led by the youth to determine the future of the youth, and where we can see some find themselves in parliament, and others find themselves to continue their activism in civil society platforms. And finally, regarding Tishreen's engagement with the early elections, from an optimistic point of view, this could be considered as a positive expansion in all directions rather than a weak fragmentation. And we can see how through the early elections, which Tishreen rejected, Tishreen is still the main topic of the early elections, despite its most of its forces boycotting these elections. And this shows that Tishreen is no longer a moment that passed. It will remain to be a permanent political identity that will play a vital role in reshaping the post-2003 Iraqi political scene. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zeidon, and thank you for sticking with your allotted time. Perfect. And next, we have Nussaibah Younis. The microphone is yours. Go ahead, Nussaibah.
Thanks, everyone. I've been asked to speak about the potential impact of these preliminary results that we have on governance reform in Iraq. And I think there's a couple of interesting things to discuss here. Number one, the great showing of Imtidad, I think, is really worth looking at. Whether it's 9 or 10 seats that they have, that's really impressive in a context where there's been a pretty significant boycott of many participants in the protest movement. For a brand new party that's formed super recently to be competing against these massive political networks that have very deep-rooted relationships in the communities, to have that showing, I think demonstrates to participants in the protest movement and to civil society, it is possible to get elected, which I think is the main message from this election. I don't think we're going to see really significant governance reform in this next government, but what we can do is use this showing to demonstrate to civil society and to activists that actually now, if you have 4 years to prepare political parties and campaigns and candidates to compete next time, and if you don't have a boycott next time, you could actually, you could get those numbers up really significantly to the point where you can have activist and protest-based parties being kingmakers in this type of system where, every 10 votes really matters. And these 10 seats are going to be important in the government formation process. They're not going to transform the system, but they're going to have some leverage. And given how disappointed and despondent so many of the activists have been that I've spoken to about the outcome of Tishreen, I think this is a glimmer of hope that is really important to capitalize on. By the same token, I think the decimation of Fatah is really the other side of the coin, which is that you don't get rewarded electorally for assassinating protesters. It's a good message. It's a good message. They are the alliance that's most heavily identified with violence against the protest movement and against activists. And I don't think that's the only reason they've done badly in the polls, but I'm sure it's a contributing factor. And I think it could lead to a reevaluation of what are the best ways to engage with Iraqi youth and with Iraqi activists who are seeking reform, because this type of aggression has not been rewarded. And it could lead, I'm hoping it will lead to further restraint in the next 4 years. And if there is further restraint, that could really allow new political parties and movements around those parties to blossom, because there's such an environment of fear at the moment. If we can loosen that up a bit, I think it would be a super interesting opportunity. I think the other interesting point is that being an elitist who talks about reform is not enough. So the very poor showing of the Abadi Hakim coalition, I think demonstrates that when you're sitting in Baghdad and talking about reform and sort of saying all the right things, but you're not performing on the ground for people in constituencies and delivering for people in constituencies, you're not going to succeed, particularly under this new electoral law. And I think the really interesting contrast to the Abadi-Hakim failure is the massive success of Halbusi and his group. What Halbusi's done, rather than talking about sort of big structural reform issues from Baghdad, he has driven investment and resources into his constituencies. Now that's providing, you know, immediate, you know, visceral, impactful, you know, difference. Is making a difference to people's lives in his constituencies. It's not all talk. It's resource diversion, and so that's quite an interesting contrast. I think. I don't think Abadi and Hakim have been able to do that, and it's something that Halbusi prioritized as governor. It's been the reconstruction of Ramadi was something to behold when he was governor, and that kind of aggressiveness around, you know, actual deeds and goods and services and infrastructure on the ground, that's rewarded, and it doesn't have to be packaged actually in a reformist agenda. You know, if you're providing something, you're delivering in the constituencies are going to reward you. And again, that's only part of the story, but it's an important element, I think, that we can take a lesson from. Obviously, the Sadrist victory here may not make much of a difference in the end to the type of government that we have. He can't govern alone. There's going to be government negotiations to form a government that is going to end up with a compromise, most likely, that will involve many of the same actors as we've seen before. So there'll be limits to what he can do in office, but I do think it's interesting to think about what Sadr would do if he did have control over government. He's talked a lot about reining in armed groups. He wants to see greater discipline over the PMUs, and he wants to really rein in the Fasa'il, the armed groups outside of the government's jurisdiction. The great irony, of course, being that he himself has a very significant armed group that I'm sure would not be on the list of groups to be reined in. Nonetheless, I think it could be super interesting for an actor like this who has strong credentials in terms of being independent from the West to be able to lead that conversation in Iraq about how to rein in non-state armed actors and how to limit violence to, you know, the Iraqi military and police forces. Or even, I mean, I'm sure that he's not going to dismantle the PMUs, but he's going to be talking about discipline and chain of command. I think that conversation is really important to have. I think Sadr, despite him being slightly hypocritical on the issue, is actually really well placed to lead that conversation. And so I think if there's anything that could come out of this Sadrist strong showing in the elections, this would be the most positive outcome. If there could be any sort of steps towards starting to rein in, you know, armed actor activity outside of the control of the state, and if the Sadrists are really prepared to push on that, I think that would be really important. I think it's also really important coming back to creating an environment in which more opposition political parties can develop and flourish. So I think that's the thing that we, you know, maybe as kind of international counterparts can try and support on, although having said that, maybe we should stay out of it since his legitimacy really comes from being an independent actor. I would say on corruption and on economic reform, I don't think we should expect anything from a Sadrist dominated government. They have, you know, they have controlled very resource-rich ministries in the last government. Absolutely no evidence of a commitment to anti-corruption measures, no evidence of a commitment to economic reform measures, particularly because that would reduce the amount of resources they would have to divert into their own patronage networks and to support their own political operation. So I don't think there's any incentive to act on that, which leads to the question, what happens if you're not going to act on corruption and you're not going to act on economic reform and you're not going to fundamentally change the system? What do you do in 18 months time when there's another sort of mass protest movement that develops because nothing's changed? Now, previously, the Sadr playbook has been to declare himself in opposition to the government and sort of, walk out of government. So if on this occasion, he wants to capitalize on the seats he's gained, and he wants to appoint a Sadrist prime minister, or a prime minister who's very strongly associated with the Sadrists and has clearly been sort of put there by them, how do they then disassociate themselves from that government's failure? He's going to have to make a choice. Does he actually want to go all in? Does he want to be seen as heavily associated with this government? In which case, how does he protect himself and his movement from the collapse in reputation, from the reputational damage that will be done by the inevitable failure to tackle corruption, economic reform, and the other kind of key issues that young Iraqi activists are looking for? I think I'm at time there, so I'll leave it there, but I'm sure we can pick up some of these themes in the discussion.
Thank you, Nussaibah, particularly for pointing out a little bit of flavor with regards to the agony of victory. There is a responsibility that comes emerging from an election of this complexity. As the winner, and it would be interesting to see whether Muqtada Sadr will emerge indeed as an effective kingmaker in Iraqi politics. Next is Abbas Kadhim. The microphone is yours. You got 12 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. This is a great time to speak about Iraq and the right in the post-elections. Thank you for the invitation, and grateful to be with this panel of distinguished colleagues and friends. And greetings to everyone, including the great, wonderful audience who is watching us from various parts of the world. Well, I'm going to talk about the impact of the elections to US-Iraqi relations, or on US-Iraqi relations. But before that, I would like to speak about the elections themselves, just to add to what the wonderful presentations we just heard from Zeidon and Nussaibah. I would like to think about it in a couple of positive signs of this election, and some, I wouldn't call them negative, but not positive signs, if we put them that way. A positive sign is that this is a very safe election, security-wise, and it was an election that went with a good amount of monitoring and from international organizations, including representatives from the United Nations and the European Union and regional and local organizations. They all spoke highly of the how well these elections were run. The elections also seem to be continuing this trend that Iraq has had, which is unique to Iraq in its history this time. And also, I would say that it is rare in the Middle East, which is a continued trend of peaceful transfer of power. Iraq until 2003, or if we were to put it between 1958 and 2003, that's about a half a century, where no former president or former prime minister or former official would be in Iraq, or if in Iraq, alive. Normally, the new regime wipes out the past regime. Now we have people coming to power, leaving power, and they remain in Iraq. They might take other positions, or they just wait for another runoff election. And this is good. So the peaceful transfer of power is very important, and it is holding as a steady trend. Also, it is important to note that in the election, votes matter. We don't know the results of the elections until now, and we are beyond about 48 hours past the election time, where in many countries elections are known before they start, and you know who is going to win. And it is the only negotiation is on the percentages at 99%, 100%, or 96%. It doesn't work that way in Iraq, and we still don't know exactly the final count. That's good. Votes do matter. And one sign that votes matter is what Zeidon and Nussaibah just spoke about, the rise of independence. That's important. There are people who spent $2-3 million on their campaigns, and they held positions. They have name recognition. They did not get a seat. And you get people like Dr. Mohammed Al-Anous in Najaf, who concocted a few election signs in his front yard, spent about $1,000 and got a seat. And he was the top vote getter in a city like Najaf, an important and highly political city. That matters. And the independents being right now the third largest bloc in the parliament, and they are, although not organized in a single bloc, but if you really combine them, they will be the third largest group of seats in the parliament. That speaks a lot about actually going to the polls matters. And I think it's a bittersweet kind of feeling for those who did not go to the elections. On the one hand, they achieved what they wanted, is to send a message that they don't trust the political establishment, that people have to pay attention to popular sentiment, but also it's a bitter in a way that had they gone in larger numbers, I think we would have seen many more independents in the parliament, and also many of the unwanted politicians would have lost. So those are I think, positive. You could talk more about positive things, but these are very important to the debate. Not so positive, of course, is the low turnout. High turnout is highly desirable in every election. If nothing, they definitely indicate high trust in the political process, and very small gap between the populace and the political leadership. But also they produce a parliament or a government that is more representative to the general sentiment of the body politic. But since the elections were fair, as I mentioned, and they were, there was no intimidation, no security problems whatsoever. Anybody who wanted to exercise their voting right did exercise the voting right. That is a very important aspect to at least to establish the legitimacy of the elections. But as I said, you lose on the benefits of a higher turnout. The other not very positive sign is basically elections are only the first phase of the process. They do not indicate or they do not dictate what happens to the next government, as was mentioned earlier also by Nussaibah and by Zeidon. And this is important. Iraqis do not elect a president. They do not elect a prime minister. They don't even elect a ruling party. They elect 329 negotiators. And those negotiators will go after the elections and sit at the table, their representatives will, and they will decide what kind of a government we will have. That is normally by setting aside the election results, the law, the constitution, and everything else. It's consociation. Also, the dictators of the terms of negotiation are not elected. They are the people who are party bosses, political movement bosses, and they are not subject to the selection of the Iraqi voters. So it is very important to remember that. And getting the number 1 or number 2 or number 3 on the list of vote getters does not mean much. A lot of people speak about a huge victory for Sadr, and it is a huge 73 votes or seats in the parliament. It's big. But let's remember that in 2014, Maliki had 95 seats, and he still could not dictate who the prime minister would be. He couldn't get it. He could not even get his first choice. So you really need to have joiners, and the joiners can be from your own sect and ethnicity, or they have to be from outside that. If it is within your own faction, then you have to negotiate how to divide the representation of your faction among the various groups. If it is with other factions, sectarian or ethnic factions, then you will have to negotiate how much you give to them. And if you give them too much, what is left for your own people to run in the next election, or even to keep the government? That is a very big dilemma for the great winner. It is a victory, but it could be a Pyrrhic victory for those who are great vote getters. We also have to remember, especially with the Shia, there are 4 blocks, and they all differ on many things, but they all agree on one thing. They do not any one of them to be too big. And that's what happened to Maliki when he got 95 seats, and the next contender was 32 seats. Everybody thought, oh, Maliki is a threat. So they all went against him, and they made sure that he would not succeed in the post-election effort. So that's important, and I think this will happen to Muqtada Sadr this time. Other Shia blocs do not want him to be too big. And that's important. Now let's turn to this issue of again, and one last thing, probably, even if I were to add, is the muhasasa, this quota system. The constitution calls for an ethno-sectarian balance in representation and in who gets the jobs and the positions in politics and in the executive sector. But it is the political parties took that and turned it into a quota system for the political parties that represent these ethno-sectarian groups, not actually having all of the representation trickle down to the ethno-sectarian groups themselves. So, and this is a problem. You see, it's not enough to be a Kurd to get a job or to get a position. It's not enough to be a Shia or a Sunni. You have to be a Kurd from that particular party to be able to get a job. It's not your merit or what you can bring to the table in terms of ability and merit and expertise. No, it is. That's why you see most of the times, and part of this failure, that they put people in the positions for their party loyalty rather than for their merit. When you speak about the U.S.-Iraqi relations, there are a few things that matter. But before this, we have to really look at the scenario of government formation. If the government formation ends up with a Sadrist prime minister, that would be a game changer for U.S.-Iraqi relations. But if it is as many people would think right now, on what it was thought before the elections, that Sadr will elect to continue having Mr. Prime Minister Kadhim in his position, that would probably be a continuation of the last year trend of U.S.-Iraqi relations with some Sadr conditions on it. And I think that is the desirable scenario for U.S.-Iraqi relations. But if you have a Sadrist prime minister, then the Sadr cannot just abandon all of the 18 years of statements and attitudes and then just turn on a dime. He has to continue for some of that, at least for the sake of the image of his movement and for consistency. And I think if listening to what Sadr said after the elections and what he always stands for, I think Assad's prime minister will see a very large truncation or reduction of the U.S. Impact in Iraq, and it will be reduced to diplomatic and maybe pro forma relations rather than what we see right now. There are 4 issues. I will close with this on the troops, and the bilateral relations in general, Iran, and the Gulf. What the U.S. wants from Iraq, and the U.S., by the way, supported the election so far. They seem to be satisfied with the results and with the way the elections have been run. And they will continue to work with whoever going to be the prime minister and whoever the cabinet will be. But one of the main issues is the continuation of the troops in Iraq. Again, if Kadhim remains, I believe that we will continue the agreement that was reached through multiple U.S.-Iraqi dialogues. And we will see the agreement to be concluded by an important withdrawal of the combat forces by the end of this year. And then maybe the Sadrists will push Kadhimi to negotiate more on the canonization of the nature of the mission of the balance of U.S. troops that remain in Iraq. So it is important in that sense. But if it's a Sadrist prime minister, you will see a complete withdrawal. And if it is Sadr and Maliki coalition, then definitely you will see full withdrawal, because both men have made their name and reputation on the basis of getting the troops out. The Iran will be important for the Biden administration, because they want Iran to come to the table on the JCPOA and also on the missiles program and several other issues of bilateral negotiation. Iraq can serve one or two ways in this. Either Iraq can be a bargaining opportunity between the two countries in order to facilitate their bilateral negotiations, or Iraq can be a facilitator of understanding. Iraq played as a mediator role between US and Iran for quite a long time. They even hosted one round of the JCPOA negotiations during the Obama administration. The Iraqis have been even moving heavier on being a mediator and negotiating or having negotiations hosted in Iraq between Iran and Saudi Arabia, US and Iran, etc. So I think Iraq can play that role now, cultivating the rise in Iraqi status and the international relations. And also the US wants to make sure that Iraq continues its trend of moving towards the Gulf states and other US allies in the region, especially Jordan and Egypt. And Iraq has made or walked a long way on these two fronts. Iraqi-Saudi relations and Iraqi-Gulf relations in general are great now. There is a huge balance that was missing before 2015. This trend continued from Abadi's government to Adil Abdelmahdi's government to Mustafa al-Kadhimi's government. The US wants the next government to continue this coordination with the rest of the Iraqi neighbors and not to be exclusively dependent on Iran. And with Israel, and this is important for the Biden administration, for US administrations, I think with this rise of Sadr, any talk about Iraq joining any kind of negotiations, normalization with Israel is silly. Iraq was already not having on the table any normalization results, but people continue to be stubbornly pursuing that. The last conference in Erbil and the fiasco that accompanied it was an idea that some people would never give up. But I think with the rise of Sadr, forget any kind of even talk about Iraqi-Israeli normalization. I will stop here and look forward to the questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Abbas. And now, last but not least, Maria Fantappie will conclude with her remarks on the Iraqi parliamentary elections. Maria, the floor is yours, 12 minutes.
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you for the Arab Center in Washington for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to discuss in this hectic time the result of these elections. And I have been asked to discuss the regional aspect and implications that this election have for relations between Iraq and its neighbors. And to me, this aspect, which is often often neglected, because we all focus on what type of coalition will come into place, what type of government will be formed. It's instead a very important aspect which deserves attention, because let's not forget that the political stability of Iraq not only depends from the type of domestic alliances that are shaping the majority, the parliamentary majority, but also from the regional environments in which Iraq is operating. As a matter of fact, I would like to remember that specifically in 2011, when we had a situation where Prime Minister Nur al-Maliki was strong, but still was caught in the middle also of a regional war, because finally, with the Syrian uprising and also transforming into a sort of regional, really polarization, forced at that time Prime Minister al-Maliki also of increasingly taking Iran's side, and that had strong domestic implication, specifically also because it pushed Iraq out of balance only on the Iran side. And also, specifically, this was combined with the moment where the US had withdrawn its forces. So the entire regional balance and also the entire US-Iran balances got basically, got damaged. And that really ended up with the emergence of Daesh in 2014. So let's not forget really that the regional developments are very important for Iraq's stability. And now we are in a very different moment than the time of the immediate post-Arab Spring. Iraq has been the convening power for a regional summit where several regional powers have met. There is also a strong drive behind the Prime Minister attempt really to sort of balance regional relations, especially between the Gulf countries and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Prime Minister himself enjoys good relation with Saudi Arabia. And also there is, despite the US disengagement in the Middle East, the US remains present in Iraq, and most importantly is also strongly behind the Prime Minister drive for having Iraq as the convening place where basically the regional powers meet, and also and overall also as a third and not less important aspect, we are in a moment where both Iran and other regional powers, and in particular Saudi Arabia, are showing signs of dialogue and engagement. So the regional environment is more propitious for Iraq's stability overall, and the Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi has been particularly proactive, together also with the presidency in promoting this delicate balancing act between the regional powers. So all this, it's very positive. However, if we look at this moment of election and how the elections results or preliminary results will affect this or impact, let's say, this regional balance, well, my answer is that what I have seen insofar is that a lot of excitement for the very low results of the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq, specifically Fatah, have in some corners raised the hope of the formation of a sort of anti-Iranian coalition that will support the next prime minister, led by the Sadrists and supported by the KDP and Halbusi. Now, to me, this discussion, I mean, when there is this framework of analysis that see like the sort of fall of the seats of Fatah as an opportunity for forming an anti-Iranian bloc, to me, this discussion results quite dangerous, because in my opinion, what instead we should try to see is in which way there could be a government formation that actually does not further polarize the political scene, and which can create actually the condition for this regional process of de-escalation and of cooperation to continue, for the future prime minister really to continue to have Baghdad as the convening place for regional cooperation. So I find that if there will be a government whereby with strong anti-Iranian taints, this could be also backfiring on the stability of the country. It could also lead some of the groups that are armed groups who are behind the Al-Fatah coalition to actually could encourage them to return to armed activity. We have seen a quite important de-escalation happening, especially since the second round of US-Iraq strategic dialogue from July up until now, in terms of rocket attacks and drones operation conducted on US and Western assets. If I think there will be a government formation that will totally marginalize these factions of Al-Fatah and others, this really could risk backfiring, because it could encourage these groups to actually resort once again to armed activity. And most importantly, also it would sort of jeopardize the opportunity for the future government in Iraq to really continue to play that role of, I will not say mediator, but at least as a convener for regional cooperation, the way that it has been playing until now. I will conclude by saying that listening to Zeidon and to other colleagues, that definitely there is a difficult balance here to be found between the fact that we have a very positive election where there is no, at least until now, there is no discussion about frauds, and there is also a sort of a limited competition has emerged with the rise of some of the independence candidates. But at the same time, we also have to face the constraints of a political system which is very slow to change. And this political system is also operating within also a regional system which has its own equilibriums. So in some way, the aspirations of the street for total overhaul of the political system in Iraq, I am not sure how much they could be met without actually placing that same government in a position whereby it will be the target of armed group, or at the same time it will be not able to lead and to support the process of regional cooperation as it has been doing until now. So difficult times ahead, definitely, and I will perhaps, I've been also asked to speak about the Kurdish element, and I will just spend my last 2 words about this. Saying that while I do think that within the Shia political scene, and when I mean Shia political scene, I do not only refer to the traditional political parties, but also to those independent candidates which have emerged in Dikar, Nasiriyah, in Najaf, and so on. We have seen within the Shia political scene a space for competition, which has allowed these new candidates to emerge. I'm instead very negative and very not as much positive that this can happen within the Kurdish political scene. I think that the strong victory of the KDP has and the low turnout has actually meant to confirm that the election, to sort of give us the signal that the elections are actually to confirm the established power, and there is a little competition left within the Kurdish political scene. I will finish here, and any further point that you want me to elaborate, I'm happy to do that in the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you all four speakers for your excellent presentations. You have generated a lot of questions from our participants, the audience, and we will spend the balance of our time, the next almost 30 minutes, in the art of conversation with our audience. Let me start with the first question. We received several remarks actually about the turnout issue, and the fact that it's about 41% thus far. And earlier, before we started the program, Nussaibah mentioned to me that it actually depends on how you calculate the turnout. Nussaibah, would you care to comment on that it could have been even worse than 41% in reality?
Yeah, sure. So the Electoral Commission changed the way in which turnout is calculated in these elections. So previously, turnout was calculated by number of people voting as compared with eligible voters. And in these elections, I believe it was changed to a calculation based on turnout as compared to the number of registered voters. So people would actually registered to vote rather than eligible voters. So my understanding is that this 41% turnout figure is artificially inflated. The sorts of numbers I'm hearing are closer to 34%, but it'd be interesting to hear what the rest of the panelists think. I think in general, sort of on the reasons for turnout and the impact of the Marja'iyya statement, I think ultimately there was a lack of confidence that the elections would contribute to any real political change, particularly in terms of reform on corruption, on public service provision, and on public sector employment opportunities and so on. And I think this next government is likely to bear that out. I don't think this next government is going to make much progress on any of those issues. But the broader question remains sort of, well, what's the alternative? My understanding is that the Marja'iyya statement didn't have a huge impact on turnout, but we're curious to hear what the other panelists think about that.
Would anybody else care to comment?
Well, if I may say something, I think the High Elections Commission should not have entered into this business of calculations. They should have stuck to their standards or what is normally used elsewhere. They almost got a page from the work of US calculating its unemployment figures. They don't go of people who don't have jobs, but people who are actively seeking jobs. So if you are not actively seeking job, you are not unemployed according to the figures that they are released all the time. I think the High Elections Commission should have, they lost focus on what the actual narrative that should be presented to the people. The actual story is that they ran a good election process. They have allowed every eligible voter who wanted to vote a vote. They made the registration easy and feasible. They made the distribution of voter ID cards available and accessible, and they have run a good election day process, safe and free and fair. That should be the narrative. Worrying about the turnout, as I mentioned earlier, the turnout is highly important for many things, but not for the legitimacy of the elections. The election is legitimate whether it was 80% or 40% or even 20%, so long as no eligible voters were prevented from exercising their rights to vote. And nobody was prevented or intimidated or even feared for their lives because of security problems. But yes, election turnout or voter turnout is highly important for many other things that will reflect on the government, on the political class, on the relation and trust between the populace and the political leadership. And this has nothing to do with the High Elections Commission. I think they should have stuck to a more measurable, more reasonable way of calculating the voter turnout and let the chips fall where they may.
Zeidon, let me refer you back. There is a question I have from Sajid Hassan, referring to what Nussaibah just mentioned a little while ago about the Marja'iyya and its role in encouraging people to vote. He's asking, what has been the impact exactly of the Marja'iyya and scholarly class in southern Iraq, encouraging Iraqis to participate in the electoral process?
Usually the Marja'iyya's influence is very prominent, if not the most prominent influence in Iraq, and particularly southern Iraq. But this takes us back to post-Tishreen Iraq. Post-Tishreen Iraq reflects that the southern provinces, which are the Shia majority provinces, are no longer accepting directions or accepting to believe that the directions can be led by either the Marja'iyya or either the traditional political parties or either the certain different religious groups, mainly the religious establishment in this case would be Najaf's establishment. They are also frustrated with Qum's religious establishment's interference in Iraq. It takes us back to this wider question to, do the southern provinces or do the Shias of Iraq, are they still influenced by the traditional forces of post-2003 Iraq? In the case of the Marja'iyya, this is an influential traditional or religious force that's been in Iraq for decades, if not centuries, but more institutionalized, more applied in post-2003 Iraq. The Marja'iyya will definitely always play a vital role in the southern provinces to encourage them to, participate in elections or to encourage them to make drastic decisions in important phases in post-2003 Iraq, such as joining the PMF in the fight against ISIS. However, that influence is decreasing. The Tishreen the post-Tishreen youth protest movement in Iraq is no longer influenced by the traditional political and religious discourse that usually drives people to make their decisions.
Thank you very much. The next one is regarding the Kurdish vote. Maria, you did refer to that in your presentation. Abdul Wahab Al-Qassab is asking, it really was a surprise that the Kurdish National Party ran its electoral showdown all over Iraq and did win. Does that mean that the KDP can become now a full-fledged Iraqi party in coming days, where many liberal and civil elements in the Iraqi political movement will join?
Short answer, I doubt it. I think that not to cut your hope, but I think that this was more the result of an electoral strategy that also reflected a strong synergy between Erbil, the KDP led by Masroor Barzani, and Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi. I think that there has been a strong synergy between the two, between Erbil and Baghdad on the idea also of perhaps aligning after in the government formation. There are also, I think, strong relationship of both have with Turkey that play a role, I think, in making them allies, and of course wish to counterbalance Iran rule in Iraq that makes them also standing on the same side. In addition to that, on a more like micro level, I will say that the KDP strategy has also changed since the referendum, because they have shifted from a political project that was axed on and only, it was focused only within really the border of the Kurdistan region, to also a renewed interest towards playing a role in Baghdad. For the KDP, this is a very new experience, and in my opinion, is something that the party is not yet comfortable in doing, because if we look at the number still of Kurdish public sector employees at the senior level that are present in Baghdad, is not very strong. You don't have many senior level public sector servant operating in Baghdad. Instead, what they are like, their investment, the party investment in Baghdad, is largely done through top leadership deal with the Shia political leadership in the capital. So I see also a lot of shortcomings in this. In my opinion, a KDP that wants to play a role in Iraq is also a KDP that reinvests within the central state institution, and therefore re-inject also Kurdish public servants within the foreign ministry or in other ministry that can play. And that, I think, lay the basis for a sustainable Erbil-Baghdad relations. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Nussaibah, the next question is for you from Ina Rudolph. You did mention in your presentation Sadr's win, impressive number of seats. And the question is, how do you think will Sadr's win affect the trajectory of Saraya Salam, where the example Saraya Salam fighters as Hasht members prevented from participating, prevented from participating in the elections? And what do the election results tell us about the socio-political climate in Nineveh and Mosul?
Well, hi, Ina. You know the answers to these questions more than I do as the specialist on that subject. Yeah, I don't see why there would be a particular impact of this strong showing for the Sadrists on Saraya Salam. I don't think there's likely, given the type of compromise that we're likely to see in the end between Sadr State of Law and Fatah, I don't see that ultimately being a particularly strong move towards security sector reform. I mean, I think it's nice that it's being discussed and maybe there'll be a conversation about it, but I don't think there's going to be significant policy change because I don't think it's in the interest of the other side. And so why would Sadr do it unilaterally? I don't think he's proven, in fact, that he's able to balance maintaining Saraya Salam and still presenting himself as a reformist figure who's against, the use of weapons outside of state structures, which is kind of extraordinary that he's been able to sell that narrative of being a reformist whilst maintaining an armed group. That's something that Fatah has not managed to do. So since he's managed to do that successfully so far, I imagine that the incentives are for him to keep going. In terms of looking at, what was the other question there was about? There was quite a few there.
Yeah, that was a loaded question. Let me see here. The impact, what does that tell us about the socio-political climate in Nineveh, especially in Mosul? Any particular implications there?
Yeah, I think in general, to talk about, I think there's quite a lot that can be said about the development of the kind of political climate in liberated areas. I think that Sunni politics has developed in quite a different trajectory, in a way that I would see as somewhere between Shiite and Kurdish politics in Iraq. It's much more, the political space for competition is much more constrained. And that's partly because of the impact of ISIS and the massive destruction of the liberated areas, and the kind of the level of fear and the day-to-day kind of influence of security actors in the area, and the reluctance of citizens in those areas to get involved in anything sort of related to public activism for fear of being kind of labeled as ISIS and being kind of targeted in that way. And also just the massive focus there's been over the last few years on people just rebuilding their houses and their livelihoods and so on. We haven't seen the same level of energy towards creating new political alternatives in Sunni areas as compared with the southern Iraq. On the other hand, it's not quite as sort of controlling as maybe some of the Kurdish political parties have become. Particularly KDP has really restrained political space in a much more kind of top-down way. It will be interesting to see as Sunni areas start to stabilize, whether there will be increasing space for kind of grassroots Sunni engagement with their dissatisfaction, which very much still exists, with their political elites that represent them, and to see if there's room for the creation of opposition parties in those areas. I think it will continue to be limited somewhat by the perception of many Sunni constituents that they need strong negotiators to negotiate sort of the extraction or allocation of resources from Baghdad to those areas. So there is, I don't think it's necessarily sectarian in its concern, but it is sort of about how you enable a prioritization, or at least a fair allocation of resources to those areas. So we're not likely to see in the short term a growth of kind of national parties dominating in Sunni areas. I think it will still be Sunni led, but I think there could be scope for much more diversity for the next elections.
Thank you, Nussaibah. Abbas, there's a question for you from Gregory F. Tendillian, a non-resident fellow at Arab Center. Do the election results signify a decline of sectarianism in Iraq, or are sectarian identities still a dominant factor in the future?
Sectarianism in Iraq, or factionalism, I would like to call it even more, because it is not just the sect, but also ethnicity plays a great role. We have to remember that people who vote not only on the religious sect, but also on the ethnicity, the Turkmen, the Kurds. I mean, these people are voting clearly for their own respective candidates who belong to the same group. And I believe that Iraq has witnessed important development and move towards nationalism since at least the October 2019 and the introduction of the Iraqi flag to the demonstrations and the national identity rather than sectarian and factional identity. But I think that we still have a comfort zone for the parties that run for elections, and also among the voters. It is very hard to see voters move from the sect. And also, let's remember that our districts are factionally segregated. I mean, there are only few provinces in Iraq that have mixed constituencies and mixed ethno-sectarian makeup. And in that also, the atmosphere is so much charged that people would like to further their own representatives' position and clout in the provincial decision-making. But I think if we were to look for one indicator, look at, for example, the way Sayyid Ammar al-Hakim fared in this election. I believe that the reason he didn't get what he expected and what many people also expected is because his message was not sectarian. He, for quite a long time, and even in private talks, he pushes for an Iraqi non-sectarian cooperative message, and that did not resonate with people who are there to push for more comfort zone, as I said, voting style. And also another example or another reason why sectarianism is very hard to get rid of at this point is because not a single bloc or a party presented a measurable governance platform. Nobody really told us how different they are from the others on the economy, on security, on unemployment, on education, on health. That was missing in the debate. So people don't really tell any two parties apart on that basis. So what they look at is really more of sectarian and also other demographic signs to choose a candidate, be it the sect, be it the ethnicity, be it the tribe, be it the locality. This is what was the dynamic really that drove the votes more than governance and deep ideological issues.
Thank you, Abbas. The next question goes to Zeidon from Anna Marham. How will the boycotters deal with the independent or imtidad in the parliament? Will they boycott them or support them? And will this cause a further fragmentation in the protest movement?
Like even during the early stages of the protest movement back in late 2019 and early 2020, protesters were very aware of the clashing priorities, such as we mentioned earlier, and like regarding the participation versus the boycott, or even in the very early stages where they were having discussions about whether they should reform or have an entire overhaul of a new political system. Some people found that less realistic than the other demands. And clashing opinions within the protest movement does not equal into a permanent fragmentation that will cause them to work against one another. So to answer the question, no, not at all. The boycotters will not boycott the Tishrini presence in parliament, which is imtidad in this case, if it remains to be Tishrini in its attitude and promises. In fact, many pro-Tishrin forces and their leaderships, such as Al-Bayt al-Watani and Al-Bayt al-Iraqi and many other Tishrini forces, did congratulate imtidad movement on social media. And they, of course, indirectly warned them, of course, in a brotherly way, that they are monitoring their role in parliament, and they're looking forward to see what they will achieve as a voice of opposition. So they're very open online about their support to them. And I believe if imtidad manages to present a loud voice of opposition in parliament without falling into this worrying trap of having to create coalitions with the traditional big political parties, this will encourage the other Tishrini forces to organize themselves and join them in the upcoming elections. Just like Nussaibah mentioned earlier, how imtidad, despite a lot of the boycotters' disagreement with them, it did encourage a lot of the forces that there is a possibility, there is a chance to start from scratch and get some votes in any upcoming elections. And if the boycotters join the next elections, it doesn't mean that they went against their current stances regarding the boycott. It just means that they have managed to achieve more as a protest movement during the time between now and the next elections, if it's happening in 2025. And as we mentioned earlier, to work on itself to have more strategic achievement and not just symbolic achievements. And a good example now is the electoral reform. That is an achievement by the first phase of Tishreen. And now we're waiting to see what the second phase of Tishreen has more to aim for in order to guarantee a more suitable environment for the upcoming elections in 2025.
Good. We have a question from my colleague Ahmad Harb here at ACW on this topic. So I think you just answered it regarding Tishreen. Thank you, Zeidon. We have a question from Justin Alexander, Director of Khalij Economics. Let me address that to Maria and Nussaibah. You have 2 minutes each to try to answer some aspect of these questions. How big a role did the smaller constituency system have in the major shifts compared to actually changes in vote shares for each party in Iraq? Maria,
I go first?
Yes, please.
Smaller constituency, meaning minorities, I believe.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Smaller constituencies, well, I mean, they always, in certain cases, they have been attached to actually specific blocks like the Babylon, like in the case of the Babylon, but I don't see them to have played, I mean, maybe the role that they have played, it was key in the disputed territories to actually allow the KDP to step in once again, especially when it comes to the return of the KDP in Sinjar, despite the KDP having, a not so good legacy over there. So I will see them having had a crucial role into the return of the KDP into these areas. But then I will defer to Nussaibah for further comments.
Nussaibah?
You'll have to excuse my dog barking in the background. So my understanding of Justin Alexander's question is he's talking about, I think, the impact of the new electoral law on the shift in voter share. I think it's been pretty important in sort of intensifying existing trends. So I think we would have seen similar shifts, but maybe less exaggerated. I think the most important impact has been, one, in empowering independence and imtidad to be able to do better than they would have been able to do by having access to sort of constituency legitimacy. So I think that was a good impact. And I think in terms of the people who've lost out, I think the new electoral system has made it very difficult for elite sort of Baghdad-based parties who have, Abadi and Hekma. I think for them it's been super difficult to translate their sort of national level reputation and their kind of strong values and reform agenda and the way that their rhetoric at a national level to be able to translate that into kind of vote distribution. I think it's really punished them for not having strong constituency-based ground game. But again, I think it's more of an exaggeration of trends we would have seen anyway. But particularly those two were the winners and the losers.
Sorry, now I understand maybe better the question. It was maybe formulated in a way which wasn't that clear. And actually, it gives me the opportunity to say something that I wanted to say, but before, which is that this new electoral law, in my opinion, it really showed that and really give a larger share to those parties and those movements who have been able to have a grassroots level presence or a local level presence. So, and this was not the case in other parliamentary election. Actually, we are not having local elections in several years, so these elements of the relation between the national parties and the localities was missing. You know, what is the link? And instead, I think that those parties who have been able to keep or to just cultivate like the independence, like a presence at the local level, have been rewarded, and also because the results show, you know, directly how many seats they have won in the specific districts. So I think that also this is a positive outcome for, I mean, to say that the new electoral law was actually successful in linking back the voters to their own candidates more at the local level. And this, we may say that it was another positive element adding to those that Abbas had mentioned before.
Thank you, Maria. Let's conclude with a quick question from Ziad Boubaker. Yes or no to all four of you. As of Monday, is the Iraqi parliament more diverse and more inclusive than in the past? Abbas, yes or no?
No.
Zeidon?
No.
Nussaibah?
Yes.
Yes or no? Okay. And Maria?
So I will join the female front on saying yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate your very insightful remarks about the elections. I know I have learned a lot, and I hope all of you in the audience have also benefited from these presentations and the ensuing discussion. At Arab Center, we're working right now on a couple of more webinars soon pertaining to developments in North Africa, particularly in Tunis, where the focus of media attention has been for several months. And also on climate change in the Middle East. So we hope that you will join us in that. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again.